Mike Maples is a friend and a partner. We have the honor of being investors in Mike's fund, Floodgate, which has invested in some of the most successful tech companies ever, like Twitter, Lyft, and many, many others. Mike has recently written a very insightful book called Pattern Breakers, about the entrepreneurs and innovators disrupting the status quo by defying established norms and creating revolutionary products and markets. And we're going to talk about it today. Thanks a lot for being here, Mike.
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks for having me.
Mike, you're one of the most probably insightful or reflective investor I've met. I think we had multiple conversations where you gathered data and turned it into insight and learnings and even actions in VC. So I wasn't very surprised when you decided to write a book. But I have to ask you, your day-to-day job is to invest in companies. Yeah. Why write this book?
Yeah, well, I didn't originally set out to, so this is a little bit embarrassing, to be honest, but in 2014, Twitch had a $970 million exit, and I didn't realize I was a shareholder in Twitch anymore because I'd invested in Justin TV, and it had morphed into two companies. So it had morphed into SocialCam, which was acquired, and then Twitch, which didn't make sense to me. So I didn't even have it in my financial statements. I had no record of owning these shares. So imagine my conversation with LPs. I say, hey, I've got good news and bad news. My audited financials aren't accurate. I didn't have this in my books. But the good news is we just made 84 times our money on this investment. Should I know we need audited financials. This isn't how we like to do things. Should I restate my financials? They said, nope, just send us the money. We're good. Got some good champagne and a bunch of other stuff. And the same week, I helped a company shut down who'd done all the stuff you're supposed to do. They had done the business model canvas. They had done lean experimentation, all the stuff that's supposed to happen, yet they had failed. And so I'm sitting here 10 years into doing this business, and I'm just wondering, what even is my business? Do I have a business? Or is this just random? Am I just a lucky fool? So has anybody ever read Nassim Taleb's books, Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness? He talks a lot about how people get fooled by the randomness that exists in markets and life. And I thought, well, maybe I'm just a lucky fool. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to study this topic a lot. And so I went down this rabbit hole for about 3 years. Wow. But it was only later that we decided to write a book, and it was because of Pete Ziebelman at Stanford Business School. So he would invite me to come talk to his class, and one day he told me, hey, I'm starting to change how I teach entrepreneurship because of the way you're talking about this. I think we should do a book. And I was like, I don't have time, I'm not going to do that. But he was really helpful and gave me the confidence as well. And so we started collaborating on it together. And when you have somebody like Peter involved, you're much more likely to actually execute on the project. And so we got it done.
Yeah, I'm glad you got it done.
Yeah.
The first concept you speak about in the books is pattern-breaking ideas, basically. Yes. And you find there are 3 elements to most breakthrough startups' ideas. An inflection, an insight, and living in the future, or what you call founders' future fit. Yep. Can you give us some examples of inflections, and how can we determine as VCs whether a startup is harnessing an inflection?
Sure. So one of the things that I learned in this process is that startups, better doesn't matter when you're a startup. Only by being radically different can you make a radical difference. And so the failure mode of a startup is to try to be a better version of something. But the problem with that is it buys into a certain context, which is that the rules that have already been established are the rules. And startups don't win by playing by other people's rules. They win by showing up seemingly out of nowhere and changing the subject. And the weapon that they have to change the subject is inflections. So an inflection is an external change event that doesn't happen because of a startup or anybody else. So like an example would be with Lyft and ride sharing. The iPhone 4S had a GPS locator chip in it. You could have had the idea for ride sharing before the iPhone 4S. It wouldn't have mattered because you couldn't have implemented a system that embodied that idea. But now all of a sudden, there was something new that wasn't true yesterday. So an inflection, it's like in math when you see the derivative change. It's a turning point where something new got introduced that radically alters human capacities and behaviors. And what the startup founder does, it's like David and Goliath. The inflection is like the rock in David's slingshot that they use to wage asymmetric warfare on the present. The startup can only win if it wages an unfair fight, because business is never a fair fight, and we're not interested in fighting fair. We're interested in making the other person react to us. And inflections are the mechanism that the startup has to sort of bend the arc of the present to a radically different future, right? If the future is a new and improved version of the present, startups are at disadvantage. Startups are at an advantage when the future can't be reconciled with the present, right? When you can't compare the future to the present.
Okay. And can you tell us what you mean by insight?
Sure. So if we continue with the Lyft example, the insight was, that means that you can do Airbnb for cars. So the insight harnesses inflections, but it does it in a non-consensus way. And so when Ann and I invested in Lyft, the question was, are people going to want to get in a stranger's car? That seems kind of crazy. It doesn't anymore, but back then it seemed pretty crazy to get in a stranger's car with a pink mustache on it. And so you have to be non-consensus and right, because human beings are conditioned to like things. And so if everybody likes your startup idea, if everybody agrees with it, it's too similar to what's already known, which means it's too incremental. And so the best startup ideas have this quality to them where most people don't like it usually, but a small number of people who believe what the founders believe are like, oh my gosh, where have you been all my life? This is unbelievable. I can't unsee this. And so you got to have the insight. And by the way, I think this is true writ large, right? Like if you want to outperform the index, you have to risk underperformance. If you're going to be a stock picker, people might say, I think Google is going to be a great stock. Well, maybe that's true, but the market's already priced how great they think Google is, right? Google's priced not by how good or bad it is, but by the wisdom of the crowds. And so when you decide to buy a Google stock, you're saying, I know something the market doesn't know. I know something that the consensus doesn't know about Google. But, every time that you take the risk of being right and knowing something the market doesn't know, you risk underperformance. If you're wrong about Google and its price, you'll underperform the index. And so the same is true of entrepreneurship. You have to be willing to make a non-consensus bet if you're going to make a difference as a startup.
Yeah.
And so that's where the insights come from.
That's interesting, because when we look at the VC ecosystem, a lot of the best startups are being hunted by multiple VCs all around. So you're basically doing something different.
Well, and quite often, so like when we invested in Lyft, it was $5.5 million post money, right? And Josh Koppelman tells me that Uber, I think, was done at roughly that same price. And Air Bed and Breakfast, which turned into Airbnb, which I foolishly passed on, Brian Chesky offered me a $1.5 million pre-money. And so now Coinbase, Gary Tan did that one at like 4 or 5 post. Why is that? Well, the non-consensus ideas aren't obvious at the time. And so when an entrepreneur is getting chased by 20 VCs and the price is getting bid up, I usually say to the founder, that should give you pause, because that tells me that your idea is pretty obvious. If you have an idea that every VC likes, why would you believe that that's a very original non-consensus idea? It's probably not. It's probably a good pitch, not a good idea. And so, interestingly, that I think is where the alpha is in seed, is to find the founder who has the true insight, because a true insight is going to be underpriced because it's non-consensus.
Yeah, really interesting. And the last item basically is living in the future. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, living in the future. So the other thing that I learned was the best startup if you want to have a great startup idea, don't try to think of a startup. And the reason is that if you try to think of a startup, you'll think of present problems and present pain and present customers. So the best startup ideas come from a founder who's living in the future before the rest of us. So a good example would be Mark Andreessen. When he was at the University of Illinois, he was building a browser. The internet had just been made legal, and everybody thought the digital superhighway was going to be designed by AT&T or the government or Time Warner or Microsoft. Andreessen was making minimum wage in this computer lab, and he built a browser based on these internet protocols. He was just trying to make the internet immediately more useful for him. And so people often ask me, where do insights come from? They come from living in the future and building what's missing in the future. If you're living in the future, you encounter the empowering, pattern-breaking new capabilities of the future, but you also encounter the barriers to achieving its full potential. And so if you build what's missing in the future, your intuition about what to build is far more likely to be right. And so that was kind of an important unlock for me, because the founders would say, I can't know if I'm right at first. And I'm like, yes, that's right, you can't. You can only know that you're non-consensus. And then they're like, well, that doesn't sound like a very good way to live, starting something that's non-consensus and I don't know if I'm right. And I realized the best way to have a high probability of being right is to live in the future and build what's missing. Because William Gibson, the sci-fi author, was right. The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And so most great startup ideas that will go public 10 years from now are embodied in a future today somewhere that somebody's living in. And somebody's tinkering with that future right now. They may not even know it, but that's where the great startup ideas come from. That's where the insights come from.
Yeah. When you talk about breakthrough ideas, you say that many entrepreneurs fall into the trap of incrementalism. What do you mean by that, and how can we avoid it, or how can founders avoid it?
Yeah, so what a lot of founders will do when they start a startup, and entrepreneurship is largely taught this way, is people will say, you should go after a big market. And so people will assess big markets, and they'll look for white space in the market, and they'll say, okay, for that white space, there's unsolved customer problems. I'm going to build a solution that addresses that unaddressed problem. But the problem is now you're fighting for a segment within an already defined market. So I'm not interested in the total available, accessible market. I'm interested in the total future market. I'm interested in products that define future markets, and the way I think that you define future markets is you ride inflections. And so the metaphor is like surfing, right? These waves happen, and as a surfer, you want to pick the right wave. So you have to have skill in navigating the board, but the right wave is like a precursor to success, in my view. And so what a lot of startups suffer from, in my opinion, is they don't have a set of underlying forces that give them the opportunity to be adequately disruptive. And so to me, the success mode is the founder pursuing something maybe with a little bit more ambiguity, but with a better wave to go chase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In your book, you said it's not enough to have pattern-breaking ideas. You also need to take pattern-breaking actions.
Yes.
So that's the second concept, basically, in the book. What exactly are those actions?
Yeah. So like the more disruptive or pattern-breaking your startup is, the more disagreeable it is. So fundamentally, when you think about it, a startup is a provocative act. It's a radical disagreement with the present. And so by way of example, let's say that you're the founders of Lyft and you launch a service and you know it's illegal, which it was. Well, you have a choice. You can go to the government of San Francisco and say, hey, we got this great idea, everybody's going to love it, we need to tweak the law. Are you willing to work with us to do that? You know what the San Francisco government's going to say. They're going to say no. And so what matters more to you, making ride sharing a reality or fitting in according to the sort of current conventions? And so the
laws, conventions.
So in the case of Lyft, right, we're in a board meeting and they tell my partner Ann, you know, we have this new idea, that we're going to put pink mustaches on cars, and it's going to be ride sharing, it's going to be awesome, and the only issue is it's illegal. Then we're like, well, is it legally ambiguous or just, you know, straight up illegal? And they're like, oh no, it is absolutely unambiguously illegal. And so it's like, is this service going to rock people's world? And Logan, who's the quiet of the two founders, says, I've never been more convinced in anything in my life. So Anne, her response is legendary. My partner Anne, she says, well, then I guess we'll have to get the law changed. And so, but that's the attitude you got to bring to it, right? Like that, you've got to be willing to say the mission to create a radically different future is more important to me than keeping the peace. You know, Elon Musk is kind of the canonical example of somebody who engages in pattern-breaking actions, right? The guy never backs down, but you're not going to blast rockets into outer space and have a successful electric car company without, you know, breaking some glass here and there.
Yeah. Let's talk for a second about competition, because as VCs, we're very used to look at the competitive dynamics when examining startups, and you basically say that with the right idea and the right storyline and the right actions, competition doesn't matter, and you need to look at something else. Can you explain?
Yeah, so I think that and this is, I like to say that a startup needs to avoid the comparison trap completely. And I gave an example the other day that some of you might have heard, but like, how many of you have seen this Tesla Cybertruck? Okay, how many want one? How many specifically don't want one? Okay, so most of you don't want a Cybertruck, right? Some of you may think a Cybertruck is ridiculous, but I doubt that very many of you would say, how does it compare to a Ford F-150, right? Like, it forces a choice. It confronts you with a choice. And great startup products have that quality to them, right? Like, they can't be compared to anything that's come before. And that's really important because the customer has to be desperate for your radical difference. If a customer has a choice to not go with you, they're not going to go with you when you're a startup because you're 80% likely to go out of business. So the startup has to show up with a product that a customer says, oh my God, I'm desperate for that and I can only get it for you. So I define product market fit as what can we uniquely offer that people are desperate for. And so if you have an insight, you have something unique, now we need to go find the people who are desperate for that uniqueness. And so to me, you know, that's why better doesn't matter with startups. You have to be radically different, and you have to have the courage to lean into that difference because that's the, you know, a startup capitalist doesn't create value with persistent compounding or competitive moats. They don't have any of those things. The startup capitalist creates value by changing the subject, and you can only change the subject by having something new to say that's never been seen before.
Yeah, really interesting. So maybe last question. We've seen too many companies that had a winning product, but did not manage to maintain momentum. How can long-term momentum and innovation be maintained?
Yeah, I like that one. Well, the one thing I've seen is that sometimes you get false positives. So an example might be, say, Clubhouse, right, which was kind of all the rage for a while and then didn't take off. But I think that I think it really does come down to finding a valid set of attractive customers that believe in your advantage and are desperate for the empowerment of your advantage. One time, Michael Seibel, who was one of the founders of Justin TV and spent a lot of time running Y Combinator for a few years, he asked me a question. He said, have you ever worked with a company that got true product market fit and wasn't wildly successful? And I thought, gosh, what a great question that is. And so I thought about it some, and I'd been doing it for almost 20 years. I couldn't name a single example. You know, I could name a lot of examples, like Twitter did not engage in any best practices that I could discern, but it didn't matter because they had product market fit. And so I asked Michael, same question for you. Have you ever seen one? You've dealt with 3,000 companies now. he said only one. It was Zenefits, and that's because they broke the law, and they broke it in a bad way. And you know, Vince Lombardi used to say, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing.
There are times when it's good to break the law.
There are times when you break the law and it doesn't go your way. But you know, Vince Lombardi, the coach of the Green Bay Packers, once said, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. And you know, that wasn't a trivial saying, because he was saying that winning comes from a mindset, right? And in a startup, 0 to 1, product market fit isn't everything, it's the only thing. You can get product market fit right and everything else wrong and still win long term. If you do everything else better, you're going to be Facebook, not Twitter. But if you get everything right but don't get product market fit right, you're not going to make it unless you find a dumb acquirer. And so I've internalized that as get product market fit, eliminate distractions, is the early days of a startup. And where I see startups go off the rails is when they misinterpret early signs of customer interest, or they do too many things, or they hedge their product strategy when they should focus it, but they don't realize that there's one job above all other jobs.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Mike, for this super insightful conversation, and for the book. I recommend everyone reading it. It's really, really amazing.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and thanks for working with us.
Yeah, of course. That's our pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.